Hello, my lovely friends. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Patty. I go by Pattymac Makes everywhere online. In today's video, it is the last video in the tutorial series related to the Power of 3 row quilt. Originally, when I came up with this idea and wanted to do this series, I thought, oh, I'll do it in 7 weeks. Well, it's 5 months later. So it took me a while. Just life circumstances, the whole thing, you know how it is. Sometimes things happen. So in today's video, let's talk about how I figured out how much fabric I needed to make this particular quilt. Because, you know, quilts are different sizes and you've got to come up with, okay, how much fabric do I need for the cutting and piecing to make the binding? Because you're basically wrapping fabric around the circumference of a very large project. And so you have to know, well, how much fabric does it take? So I'm going to break that down for you. There's a couple of measurements that are important, or a couple of areas where measurements are important, I should say. The first one is we need to know how long of a strip, because when you put in binding, you want it to be one continuous strip of fabric. So how long of a strip do we need to go completely around a project? So that's your first thing that you've got to figure out. How long does the strip need to be? The second thing that you're going to want to figure out is, okay, well, now that I know my strip needs to be, you know, X inches long, how much fabric do I need to make that binding? So it's two different things you're going to need to figure out. And I'll also tell you it's going to depend on how wide do you want to make your binding. Typically people will make their binding using 2.5 inch strips. That's kind of the normal thing. That's what everybody does. That's what I was doing for the longest time. And I'm going to tell you, because I machine sew everything. I do not sew my the last step of the binding by hand. I don't do that. I turn it, I clip it into place, and it goes right back on the machine. I just don't have time to sit and hand sew all of that stuff. If I did, I would never finish. Just, it's the truth. I can hardly get it finished machine sewing. If I hand sewed, I'd be years. It's just the way it is. If you want to hand sew and you're able to get that done, then I say go ahead and do it. That is the traditional method. So when you use that 2.5 inch strip, you know, it's smaller than you think by the time you get the binding onto the quilt, flip everything around and sew it down. You don't have a lot of fabric to work with. And so in my experience, it has been easy to like miss catching the back side of the binding when I'm machine sewing. It's also really easy to have some of the quilt sandwich peeking out where you didn't quite catch it. So I started cutting my bindings wider, and I cut my binding at a 3.5 inch strip. So I'm going to give you measurements for this quilt for both 2.5 inch strips and 3.5 inch strips. I use 3.5 inch strips now on all of my quilts. It's a little bit wider. I like it. I think it looks good. For this quilt project, I used the same fabric for the binding as what I used for the border. So it's like a tone on tone. And of course I had thread that matched. If you're newer to quilting, this is a really good way to go, because if you use the same fabric for a binding that's in your border, they're going to blend together really well. And then again, if you use the thread that is the most closely matched, you're not even going to see the stitches. So if you're off a little bit, it's no big deal. Nobody's ever going to see it, and you'll have a really beautiful finished project. Okay, so for this quilt, the Power of 3, what I did was I laid it out on the floor and I measured around. And I measured on two sides, and I measured the short side and the long side, because mine has a more narrow width than length. A lot of quilts are square. So they're all different sizes. You're going to want to pay attention to your size. Anyway, mine wound up measuring 81 on the long side, and I have to look at my notes. 81 on the long side, 68 on the short side. Okay, and because it's a rectangle, it has 4 sides. So what you'll do is measure on the bottom edge and then measure on a side. And in my case, it was 81 and 68. So I said 81 plus 68 times 2, because you have 4 sides. So 81 plus 68 times 2, that worked out to be 298 inches. So this quilt was 298 inches all the way around. Now, you're going to have a beginning and an end where you have to get that binding to go together. And you want to make sure that you have enough, and then, you do some folding in your corners, and you want to have enough left over that your binding is more than large enough to come together. So I always add 10 inches. So the measurement all the way around the quilt, which came out to be 298 inches plus 10 inches, that meant I needed a strip of binding that was 308 inches long. So my complete strip of binding, one continuous piece, 308 inches. It's pretty long. So what happens is your fabric measures approximately 40 inches on your width of fabric. That's just what it is when it comes off of the bolt. So what you have to do is to figure out how many strips do you have to cut on your width of fabric and then piece together to make it long enough. So what I do is I take that 308 inches, I divide that by 40, and that tells me a number of 7.7, and I'm going to round that up. So what that says is I need 8 strips. So I need 8 strips that I'm cutting 3.5 inches wide, because I want the wide binding. That winds up being 28 inches of yardage, and 1 yard is 36 inches. So it's almost a whole yard just to do the binding. If I wanted to do 2.5 inch wide binding, I still need the 8 strips because I need it long enough to go around, but I'm only going to cut 2.5 inch strips. In that case, I would only need 20 inches of yardage. So a little over a half a yard. So you could do 3/4 of a yard if you want to cut it close. I always say round up on your fabric, because you never know if you're going to mess up something or something's going to happen and you have to remake something. Just round it up. I find that in a lot of these quilt patterns, the way they're written, they're just giving it to you like if you do everything exactly perfect on the nose. I've never done anything exactly perfect on the nose in my life. So I add a little extra. So I hope that makes sense. And I'm going to have a blog post with all of this laid out. It's not going to be up when this video publishes. It'll be up the week following, and I'll link to it when I get it done. So if you're watching this video as it premieres, I'm not going to have the blog post ready. If you're watching this later in the future, hello, and I will link to the blog post in the description. For any quilt that you're going to do, get your circumference, which means the measurement all the way around. Take that number, add 10 inches. Take that number of the circumference plus 10, divide it by 40 inches, and that will tell you how many strips to cut. Now when you join your strips, you do that on the bias, is what we call it. So you're going to want to have everything go together at a 45, and then you're going to sew on that bias 45-degree angle, so that when you open it up, you have this beautiful joined fabric. And it's so funny how when you join on the bias, even if it's a really busy print, you just don't see it for some reason. I don't know why that works, but it works really well. So when I do any sort of border, I do the same thing. I do it on a bias. Okay, I think that's all I need to tell you about this for right now. Let's jump into the meat of the video, which is where you're going to see me doing this stuff. Okay, and I'll just show you me putting the binding onto the quilt. So I should tell you before we get into that. So now all of your strips are cut. You've joined everything. It's this beautiful bias. It's a beautiful bias seam. The next thing you're going to do is to trim off so that you have that 1/4 inch seam allowance. You're going to press those seams open and just press out your whole long strip, your 308 inches in this case of fabric strip. Press that out so that all of the seams are open and everything is really nice and flat. The next thing that you do when you're making a binding is you're going to fold the fabric in half, wrong sides together. So you're making this, you're folding the fabric so that the pretty side is out. Hold on, let me show you. It's cloudy, so I had to change the lights. So anyway, as I was saying, you have a strip of fabric, and when you go to make the binding, you're going to fold it in half, long ways, so that the raw edges are together and you have a piece that looks like this. And then you're going to press that so that you have a really nice crisp edge over here. So basically you're just going to make it like half of what it was. And when you get the whole strip all the way down, all 308 inches pressed into place like that, that's your binding. And then what I do is I use my phone, it's a good size, on the short edge, and I just wrap it all the way around into a nice neat bundle. And I work from that wrapped bundle to then get it onto my quilt. Because your binding is a 2-step process. The first step is to get the binding attached to the quilt. So you're going to get the binding onto the quilt, and then you do that funny folding I told you about in the corners. It's on the quilt. The next step that you're going to do is to turn the binding. And when you turn it, that's how you're going to encase the raw edge of the quilt. And you're going to pull it around to the back side, clip it in place, and then in my case, I machine sew close to that seam, and then that encloses the quilt edge with the binding. Okay. I do have video of this, so let's jump into the video of what I did, and I'll show you how I did it, and I'll describe as it's going on. Okay, I'll see you on the other side. The first thing we'll do is to cut off the edge and make sure that we have a nice straight edge on our fabric that we're using to cut for the binding. I've got my quilting ruler in place, and I wind up using that little small ruler just as a visual aid to make sure that I have it lined up properly. I can really have some issues with all of the lines and the numbers running together. So for me, as a double check, putting the ruler in the size that I need helps me tremendously. Now that we have our strips cut, and in this case I've got 8 strips to join, what I do is lay the first piece horizontal on my cutting mat, and I make sure that it's lined up with lines, and then I will take the strip that I'm going to join, I place it face down so that we're right sides together. And I make sure that I am also lined up on a line. Doesn't matter what line, just pick one. And then what we're going to do is to sketch on the sewing line that we need. And it's a 45-degree angle, and we're going to go from the upper left to the lower right. And the line that I've marked is your actual sewing line. You're going to sew on that line. And I use pins on both sides of the line to secure the fabric. That's in place, and now I'm removing my pattern weights, and I'm just going to fold the last strip right side up and do the same thing. And you can see I'm really taking my time to make sure that I'm right on that line. I want to have everything joined as straightly as possible so that I get the best possible look to the seam. And then the next strip goes on. Also, what I want you to notice is that I've made sure that the selvages, I didn't cut them off before. I leave them on, and then I just leave plenty of extra room on either side so that when I've sewn my sewing line, what I will do is to cut at a 1/4 inch. So I'll leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And at the time that I cut the seam allowance, it will remove all of the selvage. So it's just, I don't know, it's just a way to save a step. And that's the way I do it. And I'll do them all like this at one time and then chain sew all of the binding at once. Okay, we're back, and I have the binding all ready to go. And you know, it's pretty big. There's a lot here. There's 8 strips, and as you saw, I cut them all on with the fabric, and then I joined them on the 45, and there's a join right there. And it just looks so nice. And when you get this onto your project, you're not even going to see the seam, and I really like that. So one thing I will tell you is that this is a much wider than usual binding, and I cut this binding at 3.5 inches. So there's your strip. And typically you're going to see a binding cut at 2.5. So you can see the size difference at full inch. And you know, if the quilt police are out and they're giving tickets, I'm going to get one. And I don't care, I'm going to pay the fine, because this really works well for me. So, you know, when you make your binding, and I have a binding video that I'll link to for you if you really want to see how that is done. But the thing with this is, you take your strip and you join all of the pieces, and then you're going to fold it in half and press it. And if I did it on the 2.5 inch strip, that's all I've got to work with. And honest to goodness, it's not that much. And, you know, you're going to lose like, you know, your 1/4 inch or a little more and the seam allowance, and then that's all you've got to get wrapped around your quilt and attached down. And if you're sewing by hand, I think it's easier to make sure that you catch everything on the back side, but I'm doing everything by machine, and it's not as easy. So we're going to go ahead and get this on the quilt today. And I neglected to press over the end there like I should have. So we'll just finger press it down. Okay, so you're going to need your binding, and I use Wonder Clips to attach this onto the quilt. And I decided for this quilt to go ahead and use the same color, same fabric for the binding as I have for the sash or the border. And the reason for this is if you don't get everything to absolute perfection, it's fine, because it's all going to blend in so beautifully. So it's kind of that tone on tone feel. So Let's see, we are on the tabletop of my work table, and I'm going to open this up on the short side on the bottom and start attaching binding, and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so I'm on the tabletop, and what I'm going to do is take that binding and just open it up some, and you're going to take the raw edge and meet that to the raw edge on your quilt. And then I'm just going to take Wonder Clips and attach it on. So you do the binding in 2 steps. The first step is to actually get it affixed to your quilt. And then in the next step, what we will do is flip the binding over and do the last finish. I always think the binding, to me the binding is the hard part because it's the last thing. Especially when you turn everything, because it's the last thing that you see. It's your last step. And oh my goodness, if you don't get it just right, you feel like you've messed up your whole project. It's pressure, right? It's a lot of pressure. So anyway, so we're coming to the end. And again, all I'm doing is just affixing. Now when you get to the end, you're going to want to turn that corner. Move this so you can see what we're doing. And what I do is I like to use this ruler that I've got. And so what I'm going to do is mark the 1/4 inch, which is right here. Okay, and so when I'm sewing along, that line is my cue. And what I will do is I'll sew my seam, attaching this to the quilt. When I get to that line, I don't know if you can see it or not, it's right here, this line. What I will do is sew to that line, and then I'll go 45 degrees off. And you can actually mark it. I fuss a little bit about some of this extra stuff, but I think it's helpful. So now I've marked it, and I know that as I approach this end, when I get to here, I'm going to stop sewing there, and then I'm going to flip the whole quilt, which is quite a task, and just sew at the 45 off. Okay? And then we'll come back to the table, and you're going to do some flipping around. And what you're going to wind up doing is flipping your binding back and then running it this way up the side. And you want to make sure that it's like square, and then you'll attach and then go on. But anyway, we have to do this part first. So okay, I'm going to do that, and then I will come back and meet you here and show you what that looks like. All right, I'm back, and so you can see that I've got this portion of the binding on, and you can't even see the stitching. And when you flip it back, that's how your binding's going to look. So it's just this really nice tone on tone. And if you match the thread like I did, when you machine stitch it, if you're not perfect, nobody's ever going to know. So make your life easy where you can. So, all right, now we're going to turn the binding, and this can be a little bit tricky. So I use my triangle ruler for this. I watched Karen on Let's Get It Done Quilts, and she like made a little piece that she uses, And she's so good about like making her own tools, but I already had this, and I'm not great sometimes about getting angles perfect or whatever, and I like the neatness of a tool, so I just use this. It's called a half square 4-in-1 triangle ruler, and I never use it for that. To be honest, I'm not even sure how you use it for the half square triangle, but this is what I do with it. So we made those marks, and I sewed at that 45-degree angle off. So now what we want to do is we want to get the binding on this side, and this is the long side. So you're going to fold it towards you, and you just kind of pull it snug. So you've got that nice 45 degrees, and then here's your edge of your quilt. And then you want to fold it. And you're going to have your binding going that way. So what we want to do is we just want to make sure that this fold is right along the edge of the quilt. And then we'll attach. And then we want to make sure that everything lines up over here, because you've got that fold of fabric. So just make sure that all of that lines up. And I'm just going to clip it in a couple spots. Okay, and that's your corner. And then you're just going to go right up the side. And again, you want the raw edge to meet the raw edge, which I know it feels really weird. The first couple times you put these on, you feel like, oh, this can't be right, but it is right. And that's all we're going to do at this point, is just stitch this on. And you can see that I still have some pins in here. So what I could do, because they're a little close, I might go ahead and remove the pins, because I don't want to sew over the pins with the walking foot. And I should tell you, I'm sewing on my heavy duty machine, the Singer Heavy Duty, and I do use the walking foot attachment. I find that the walking foot makes such a difference when you put the binding on, because you have so many layers. So this is 2 layers. Let's see, your quilt sandwich is 3 layers, and then your binding is 2. So you're sewing through 5 layers. It's a lot. So I just find that having that walking foot really does help to keep everything nice and straight as I'm sewing. And your binding will get a little bit twisted as you're unrolling it and getting it on. And you want to make sure that you're clipping the back as well as the front. And I mean, you can see it's kind of a thick sandwich, and it's real easy for it to get off. And it's also easy for like the backing to not be exactly perfectly on with the front. So I like to do a seam that is just a little bit wider than that 1/4 inch as I'm putting on a binding. And again, if you go with a little wider cut of a binding, you can a lot more easily have those slightly wider seam allowances. Okay, I'm just going to keep doing this and just work all the way around. And when the binding is completely on the quilt, I'll come back and we'll turn it, and we'll be on our last bit of stitching. Okay, I've sewn all the way around the quilt, and I'm back to where we started. And you can see when I pull it back, this is how the binding's going to look. So when I started, I left all of this unsewn. So it's maybe 8 inches or so. And then as I cut here, I have this much of a tail. So it's a good length of a tail. And trust me, you rather have more of a tail than less of a tail, because if you come up short, you've got to like think on your feet and somehow attach a little bitty strip on to finish the quilt. Whereas if you have just a little bit too much, no big deal, you just clip it off, which is what we're going to do. Anyway, so I've sewn all the way around. We're back to the beginning. And what I have, and let me tell you, here's another issue the quilt police is going to have. Typically what you do is you measure and trim and do this and do that, and then you bunch the stuff up, and you're going to join the beginning and end on a 45. And here's what I do. I take the beginning end and I just put the raw edge under. I didn't even worry about taking selvage off. Again, they're not going to like that. Oh boy, I'm going to be doing hard time in the pen based on all of these violations. Oh, okay, so I just fold under, and what you're going to do is then take your tail and you're going to tuck it in. Okay, and so here's where I stopped sewing. So I'm going to run this tail about that long, maybe. Again, I rather have a little bit much than be short. And then what I do is I tuck the end inside where I started and just get that all nice and neat up along your edge. Okay, and then clip. Okay, and then you're just going to sew right over, and then you'll get to this point where you have the join. And of course when you flip it, it's going to be a straight edge, but that has never bothered me, and I do all of my quilt bindings like this. So yeah, we'll get it on and we'll get it sewn, and then I'll just flip it and show you how it looks completely done. But I wanted you to see that I'm just tucking the end tail inside the beginning flap, and then this is over so that you don't have the raw edge. And okay, that's it. I'm going to run it through the machine and I'll be right back. Alright, I've got the binding completely attached to the quilt, and here's the join. And when I flip this over, what I'll wind up doing is I'll take this to my iron and I'm going to press it out so that this press is nice and flat. But what we're going to do is we're going to flip the binding over and then attach it. This is how I do it, using those Wonder Clips. And then what I do is I stitch in the ditch along here, and then that attaches the binding to the quilt. And then you stitch in the ditch on the front, and then it catches the binding on the back. So you basically can just machine sew it, and within an hour your binding is done. Now I know a lot of people prefer to hand sew, which of course you can do that. I don't do that. It's just, I would never get it finished. That's just the way my life is. So I machine sew everything on my quilts. And what I will do is I'll come back on and I'll show you how we're going to turn the corner. Because basically you're going to have these funny little flaps. You're going to have these funny little flaps at all of your corners. And what you're going to do is, as you turn this, let's remove that. As you flip it over, you're going to want to take some of that weight out of the corner. So we're going to just nip that little edge, that clip a corner. We're going to pull this over, and look how beautiful that does. So this will wind up getting flipped over first, and then, like I said, I like to press it as I go So you press it, and then you have this nice long area here. And then when you go to sew on this side, it just comes over like that. And you can really position it and get a beautiful, perfect corner. And then continue on. And I'm going to tell you, I've never had such beautiful corners until I started doing the wide binding. And I'm sold on it. So to me, wide binding for the win. So, all right. When I get this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and sew a short side and a long side and get those all done. And I'll come back and I'll show you what it looks like. And then I'll just kind of show you the flipping over and the attaching. I mean, it's pretty basic, but you know, I just like this. And then you know, on my seam, it's a little bit wider than 1/4 inch, and I like that because it's just really, really secure. I don't have to worry about catching any of the fabric, and I have all of the sandwich is on that seam. So I've captured the entire sandwich with the first stitching of the binding. Anyway, I've never in my life had my corners look so good as when I went to the wide binding. Okay, that's it for now. I will check back in with you and give you the update when I've got that bit done. Okay, we're turning our binding, and I just want you to see I've started turning, and I use the Wonder Clips to hold it in place. And when we say turn the binding, what we mean is we're going to take our binding and we're turning it over that edge. And that is what is going to encase this, the raw edge of your quilt. So see how it comes around? And so what you want when you turn that binding is to cover all of this. So we're going to go ahead and bring it around. And the goal is we're going to sew like in that seam. And we know where that seam is because we can look at this stitch line here. So we want to make sure that as we pull the binding over to the back side, that seam is well encased in the binding. And the reason is then we know that as we sew along on the front side in that seam, we're going to catch everything on the back. Alright, so we're coming now to this edge. And this is why I like the wide binding so much, because it just naturally turns itself. Alright, so there we are, and it's going to just kind of come off that edge. And then what we're going to do is when we go to the new side, we're just going to turn it, and it's a little bit bunchy there, so you know what we're going to do is we're going to take some of that weight out of the corner. Let's do that. You want to be really, really careful how you trim in this corner, because what you've got is you've got stitches going this way and then you've got them coming this way, and we don't want to cut through any of those stitches. So we're just going to make sure that all of our binding is rolled back, and then we're just going to take that little bit out of that corner. Okay, so come back, and it rolls so beautifully. Guys, the wide binding is just everything. Okay, and then we're going to come to the other side, and then as you roll that over, you have the space now to make that really beautiful mitered finish on your back side. So your front is going to give you a really nice corner, but I just always had such a struggle getting that perfect, beautiful corner until I did the wider bindings. And that's how your front is going to look. And then there's your back. Again, this is not going to be approved by the quilt police, but sometimes you just have to get some things done. And I say this to you often. And the deal is, you have show quilts, which are quilts that are going to go into like county fairs and, you know, things like that. Things that are art pieces for fairs and things like that. Museum shows, that type of thing. Exhibition quilts. And then you have quilts that we make as everyday people. And it's a different kind of thing. And I make quilts for everyday people. And I show you how to make quilts for everyday people. And I mean, to be honest, I think that's a good place to start. And then as you go along, if you really wanted to, you could grow into doing full exhibition quilts. Like there's quilt museums and things like that. I mean, you can get way out there. You could get into restoration type of stuff. But that is not what this is. This channel is just quilting for everyday people to just kind of give you some, I guess I'm going to call them shortcuts. People don't like the terminology of shortcuts. And some people don't believe in using shortcuts. I believe in a few shortcuts. That's just what it is. But again, I'm not making this particular object to be in a museum show. Okay, and I'm just turning. Now I'm not going to have enough wonder clips to finish going all the way around, so I'm going to stop at this point. And what I'm going to do is go to the machine, and I'm going to go ahead and just sew right in here as close as I can to the ditch. If you wanted to pick a side of the ditch, I would say to sew on the binding. If you could sew just to the outside of that seam, then not only is it going to look really nice, it's going to absolutely catch on the back. Alright, I'm going to go do that, and I'm going to come back and show you how it looks. It'll be all finished by the time I come back. Wound up sewing just to the outside of that seam, and you can hardly see it because I matched the thread to the fabric, but you can see I've got my nice mitered corner, and then as I turn it over, it mitered into that nice corner, and then the stitching catches. Now there is a little bit of play here with the binding. It's not sewn perfectly down, where if you were able to take the time to hand stitch this, it would be completely perfect, and this would be adhered down. But for me, I just wind up doing it this way. That is today's video. As always, I really appreciate you watching. I appreciate you being here. I don't have a channel without you, and just thank you so much for watching. I truly hope that you have enjoyed this project as much as I have. And yeah, now that we're kind of through this big mega project, let's get into doing some smaller things and having a good time with some smaller projects. And I have so much that I want to share with you, and it's all coming soon. And I'll look forward to chatting with you in the comments. And I think that's all for today. Thanks again, and I will see you in the next video. Until then, happy quilting.